It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, everybody.
And, of course, the man of the hour. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Well, Joe Biden has been inaugurated as the 46th president of the United States with a call for unity and healing. Certainly a welcome message, especially in contrast to 4 years before when the theme was American carnage. But before the healing can begin, there needs to be a reckoning. You can't put a Band-Aid over a festering wound and expect to get well. We need to apply some medicine, and that might sting a little. We have another provocative show for you today with two great guests. But before we get to that, we want to talk about how even though the Trump administration has finally come to an ignominious end, the Trump era still looms large. And one of the first tasks of the new administration will undoubtedly be assessing the mess they left behind. I know Ralph has some strong ideas on this. David, why don't we start by having you read one of Ralph's recent tweets?
Okay. As Biden's nominees move into federal agencies/departments, they will find stunning wreckage, waste, Trumpian law-breaking, dismantled health safety enforcement, corrupt cronyism, and devastated civil servants. They should report these findings to the American people fast.
Yes, because there really needs to be a marker that separates what the Trumpsters did in all these agencies, EPA and FDA and the Auto Safety Agency and OSHA, and what Biden wants to do. Because what will happen is the spillover from the wreckage that will take a long time to roll back and clean up will start to be on the backs of the Biden successors who take these agencies more seriously. Let's face it, Biden has a very easy act to follow, but he doesn't want, I wouldn't think, the spillover on the things that are going to come out, the corruption, all the stories and the reports, wait and see, to, in effect, start afflicting his nominees because they can't reverse everything so quickly. And that's why I think a marker, putting out a report to the people. Here's what they found at the EPA. Here's what they found at OSHA. The lack of any enforcement of job safety and health standards, not even having standards for the frontline workers in the present pandemic, and so forth. So that's what I hope they will do.
Right. In contrast, there was a book written by Michael Lewis called The Fifth Risk, which started as a New Yorker piece and then became a full book about the transition from Obama to Trump. And the thrust of it was how little interest the Trump people took in manning those agencies. The Obama people were all there with their briefing books, and nobody was showing up.
Well, that's what we have to face up to. Our civil service has been degraded, devastated, hollowed out. A lot of great scientists and other professionals in the federal executive branch have been pushed out or just retired and discussed because they were basically either overridden, like a lot of the scientists in the Centers for Disease Control, or they were given window jobs. In other words, they were put in an empty office and shunted aside and not allowed to do anything, and they were collecting their pay. So there's going to be a lot of waste, a lot of corruption, a lot of dismantling of health and safety law enforcement, a lot of corporate cronyism, passing out all kinds of contracts to cronies and subsidies, giveaways. There's going to be a lot of that, and we've got to see what it is, because if the Senate doesn't do its job, Mr. Trump will be looking for a second act in 2024, which brings us to the first quote.
Yes, well, this is something quite interesting, Ralph, you sent us, because the storming of the Capitol on January 6th resembled another historical event that took place in Germany in 1923 called the Beerhall Putsch, which was a failed attempt by Hitler and his fellow Nazis, about 2,000 of them, to overthrow the government of Bavaria, and was supposed to be the first in a series of steps to overthrow the entire Weimar Republic of Germany at that time. It ended with Hitler being arrested and sent to prison, where he dictated his manifesto Mein Kampf. Just to give you an idea of the mindset back then, I'm going to read you an item from the New York Times from 1924. The headline is, "Hitler Tamed by Prison. See if you can identify any parallels what could happen today. It says Hitler tamed by prison, released on parole, he is expected to return to Austria from 1924. Adolf Hitler, once the demigod of the reactionary extremists, was released on parole from imprisonment at Fortress Landesberg, Bavaria, today, and immediately left in an auto for Munich. He looked a much sadder and wiser man today than last spring when he, with his Ludendorff and other radical extremists, appeared before a Munich court charged with conspiracy to overthrow the government. His behavior during imprisonment convinced the authorities that, like his political organization, known as the Volksherr, was no longer to be feared. It is believed he will retire in private life and return to Austria, the country of his birth. That was from 1924 about what would happen to Hitler after the Beer Hall Putsch.
Now, let's look at today with Donald Trump. And by the way, Hitler and his cohorts were elected before they seized the power in the Reichstag. Donald Trump, right now, can run for re-election in 2024. He got tens of millions of votes. The only way to stop him is to have the Senate convict him by 2/3, and I think more Republicans are starting to lean in that direction, led by Mitch McConnell's recent statement. And after that, by a simple majority vote, they can strip him of the right ever again to run for any federal office, whether it be the president or any other federal office. And that's what has to be done. This idea is, he's out of office, the healing process, why be divisive? He basically led a assault on the Capitol, storming the Capitol, and more is coming out that it wasn't totally spontaneous. And his own ally, Mitch McConnell, attributed the mob to what Trump did, speaking to them and goading them. And so this is a trial that's coming up very shortly, presided over by the Chief Justice Roberts, and he has to be convicted. Some of the Republicans, I think, are going to vote for conviction because they don't want him to torment them and trash them and undermine them and insult them in the next 4 years all over the country. So there is a lesson from that quote in the New York Times for the present day.
I think it's interesting how all these MAGA politicians spent the last 4 or 5 years looking backwards, make America great again. And then as soon as they're called to account, it's like, no, it's time to look forward. Let's look forward.
Yeah, well, of course, that comment of yours, Steve, reminded me of Barack Obama, who came into office after the war crimes of Bush and Cheney and the crimes of Wall Street. And he said he wanted to look forward. He didn't want to look backward when he was asked whether he would like the Justice Department to initiate criminal prosecutions. Well, criminal prosecutions always look backward. And he forfeited a huge opportunity to install the rule of law and constitutional observance. And we don't want this to happen again.
Well, that's an excellent segue, Ralph, into our first guest. We're going to be welcoming back Professor Adolph Reed, who has written extensively on political science and the history of American liberal movements. He will join us to discuss the end of the Trump era and some burning questions about the future, especially of the American left. Now that the Democratic Party has some power in the federal government, how will the progressive wing of the party, after getting on the Joe Biden train, keep from becoming marginalized yet again? What should the American left demand for its support? We'll be talking to Professor Reed about that and many more things. Our second guest is constitutional scholar and good friend of the show, Bruce Fein, who came on our program last October to outline 14 reasons President Trump posed a clear and present danger. We're happy to be a stop on his I Told You So tour. And as usual, somewhere in between, we will take a break to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, what does the future hold for American democracy in general and the American left in particular? David?
Professor Adolph Reed is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at University of Pennsylvania. He was a volunteer on Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. He is the author of numerous books and articles dealing with race and class in American society and writes regularly for the New Republic as well as The Nation. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Adolph Reed.
Oh, hi, David. Thanks for having me. It's always good to be back.
Thank you again, Adolph. Let's talk about the Biden nominees to present time. He has nominated more women to high posts and Hispanics and African Americans than any other president so far. And there's no indication he's going to stop doing that. And this, of course, is very important, not just symbolically, but to show that upward mobility, professionally and occupationally, the doors are opening to higher positions of power in the executive branch. But I always thought that diversity had to be more than that diversity had to mean a difference in policy and not simply have more diverse people in high positions of power producing the same corporatist, the same obstructionist, the same bureaucratic results, whether it's military policy, foreign policy, Wall Street, or otherwise. What's your view on the argument that we're seeing more diversity, but we're not likely to see more diversity that makes a difference?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, as you say, Ralph, you can't really quibble with the significance of demonstrating that the ceilings on aspirations have been raised or maybe even dissolved for women as women generically, for blacks generically, Hispanics as Hispanics, gay and transgender people as those categories, etc. But if this comes with acceptance of a framework in which the society overall is becoming more and more unequal, then it's cold comfort to know for a black postal worker whose job is being squeezed to the limit or possibly outsourced or privatized to know that pick a black person in the cabinet is the black person in the cabinet. And it's interesting, like if we sort of peel back, the origins of diversity as a sanctified ideology, and recall, for instance, that it really was just it was ultimately like a corporate intervention that's a concession to legitimize affirmative action plans in the face of a conservative tacking court that was inclined to reject them as in the racial preferences. The ideal of diversity has largely, I think, been built on a castle in the air, basically, right? I mean, because clearly most of us would think automatically that a radically unequal neoliberal world that's committed to diversity as a value is less bad in some ways than a radically neoliberal world that intensifies inequality but is not committed to diversity as a value. But it just seems to me that for the vast majority of people in this country, the real preference would be for a broader set of choices.
This has its precedents. I mean, we used to have an all-white Congress, and then there was a time a few years ago when some of the major chairs of major committees in the House, for example, Ways and Means, Judiciary, were in the hands of African-American elected officials. There wasn't that much difference. And we had President Obama, who gave Wall Street a free ticket and didn't seem to do much shifting of power for African Americans or other minorities, although his rhetoric was more reflective of his experience growing up. But it's a touchy subject. But I remember going to the offices of African American legislators and couldn't get them to have hearings on the economic exploitation in the black ghettos.
Right.
I mean, you would think, that was the payday rackets and rent-to-own rackets and food deserts and lack of police security because the police were patrolling upper-income areas more in cities around the country. What do you think needs to be done here in terms of the groups who get this point around the country? I mean, it's sort of like a time when everybody is self-congratulating themselves as Democrats. Look what they've done. They've retired the tyrant to Florida. There's a period of smugness, self-satisfaction, and just another round of Clinton and Obama.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Well, I mean, I don't think we really ever expected Biden to be anything more than that. And he's told us from the very beginning, from practically the day that he filed for the nomination, was that his greatest virtue was being able to reach across the aisle and find points of unity.
He vetoed single-payer universal health insurance.
Right. No, absolutely.
Adolph, you subscribe to the idea that Biden 2 is going to be better than Biden 1 because of Trump?
Well, what I have seen, Ralph, is that he gave a couple of speeches in the last week and a half in which he laid out policy positions that give the likes of us reason to have some optimism, or at least to be open, right? That it might be possible to move around the edges in a Biden administration. Certainly, Walsh's appointment as labor secretary is a big plus, or at least potentially. But how many times have we been through this before? And in fact, I'd say in particular, like I remember a guy I played basketball with in New Haven who was an American Studies graduate student who, during the run up to the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing, was joking one day about all those people who were saying that because Thomas had been poor at one point and was black, despite his record, once he got the job for life, he would pivot and do good things. And my buddy described this as the he's due theory from baseball, right? Like you send a guy to the plate as a pinch hitter because he was 0 for 27 on the theory that because he hadn't had a hit in 27 times at the plate, he'd be due to get a hit on the 28th. And of course, the world doesn't work that way, right? And the probabilities don't work that way. I mean, I think when you get down to it, Biden, like any one of these elected officials at like any level, is going to be as good or as bad, as strong or as weak as the political forces that he feels he has to respond to. And I've said this about everybody, from my old friend Paul Wellstone to Martin Luther King on down, that public officials are ultimately, to some extent, unless you're a confessor or biographer, are holograms that are produced by the political interests and the forces that they feel that they need to respond to. The left in this country is so weak that it barely makes sense to talk about there even being a left. And from that perspective, like, we can assert a little moral force in public, but the real challenge is going to be what force we can present that the Biden administration believes that it needs to respond to in some concrete ways. And I don't see us getting much closer, to Medicare for all in the first Biden term than we have been so far, or to other kinds of reforms like that. I'd be happy to be proven wrong and want to be part of trying to prove myself wrong. But
the 800-pound gorillas are not part of the discourse of the Democratic Party, and that's corporate power. And it's amazing how even left discourse talks about racism, talks about empire, talks about exploitation. They never talk about corporate crime in particular. They almost never understand that this is a corporate-dominated society, that this is a corporate state in Washington, Wall Street merging with government and turning government against its own people.
Right.
And that's the real tragedy. I mean, single payer is an issue because corporations, largely health insurance companies and hospital chains, have blocked the people from having universal health coverage.
Right,
and
absolutely.
As a result, over 100,000 people a year die, according to Yale's study, because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. And hundreds of billions of dollars are defrauded every year. We've talked about that in the program. When it comes to labor, the 800-pound gorilla are the corporations, not just the gig economy. It's the freezing of the minimum wage. That's corporate power. The blocking of union organizations to defend themselves and advance themselves as workers. That's corporate power. The looting of pensions by corporations. That's corporate power. The looting of investors in the 2008-2009 Wall Street collapse, trillions of dollars. That's corporate power. The distortion of public budgets, Adolph. I mean, who controls more than any other force the allocation of public budgets? So much goes to empire and the military, and so little goes to public works and infrastructure here at home. How do you count the lack of even simple phrases like corporate welfare, corporate crime, corporate domination? It's not part of the discourse, even among the new leftists that are coming up and putting out the material. And look what corporations are doing to children, exploiting them, sidelining parental authority, feeding them junk food, junk drink, which Mark Bittman, in an op-ed in the New York Times a few days ago, said was deadly, lethal, killing people prematurely, high blood pressure, youth diabetes, etc. And even the Black Caucus almost
Right.
never talks about what corporations are doing in low income areas.
Yeah.
What do you think about all this?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, once you accept and even sort of find a way to like craft a simulacrum of a left politics around a fundamental mindset that corporate power is just nature and there's nothing we can do about it except maybe make some little penetration against, I mean, the very edges of it, or the reshuffle allocations within the fundamentally unequal regime of corporate power, then you can't go anywhere, right? I mean, you can't do anything. You can't win anything. You can't challenge anything. And this is one of the reasons, since we want a provocation, I got a provocation for us, that I see what I've been calling, the great awakening of the politics of the last 6 months as being at bottom the opposite of a left politics. And if anything, it's much closer to a club that corporate power can use to beat left aspirations over the head, I mean, politically. And when you think about it, I am sure you recall back in the summer when some of the most egregious corporate predators in the world were falling all over themselves to pony up large sums of money to show their commitment to some version of racial justice, right? And some, in fact, of the Black Lives Matter activists pointed to the relative willingness of corporations, and again, some pretty terrible ones like Uber and Bezos, their willingness to support a race-first political agenda more lustily than nominal leftists were, as a sign of that the corporations, to put it crudely, are like better citizens than those of us who want to try to challenge corporate power and to recapture like the wealth of the American people for the American people. And I think that there's a political tension there, and it's not just that people are, some people are mistaken. I think there are people who have chosen their sides accordingly.
Well, the corporations and all those full-page ads you mentioned last summer, basically they sounded like the NAACP or the ACLU.
Oh no, they did. Yeah, they definitely did.
But the whole strategy behind that is, number one, is to just let these minorities in, become good consumers, have them have a piece of the pie, and have them be part of the corporate capitalist system.
Right.
That's one. And the other is, this is really pretty stunning, Adolph. There is a recent poll that asked the people, who do you look on most favorably? Do you look on nonprofit groups? Do you look on labor unions? Do you look on academics? Or do you look on business? And business came in on top. I mean, the whole rape of the economy, the destruction of the federal lands, the corporate-sourced climate disruption, the corruption of our campaign system with corporate money. And they've got a sheen of Madison Avenue benevolence around them, where they are even duping people who answer to these polls.
Right. Well, and that makes sense because this is all people have been hearing for like the last 40 years in a bipartisan chorus. And that's why I think that in addition to doing whatever we have to do to try to stop the bleeding and contain the worst excesses, the only way that we're going to get the movement that we need to try to change the center of gravity in American politics is by a renewed campaign of actual civic education. It may sound hokey, but I mean, conducted in neighborhoods and not just in schools and in union halls and workplaces and not just questions like, how a bill becomes a law, but
I don't think it's hokey at all. You remember from our history, Adolph, the populist movement started with farmers becoming lecturers. They called themselves going from farmhouse to farmhouse in terms of educating people about the brutal role of railroads and banks to their livelihoods. They knew that, the farmers, but the education was what to do about it. And they launched the biggest progressive populist movement in American history.
And that's exactly what we need now. And what I think Ralph, that at the Debs Jones Douglas Institute in concert with the Labor Institute, this is the kind of worker training model that we've been developing and taking into the labor movement. and elsewhere. And that's the only way we're going to turn this around. And the unfortunate thing is that, well, I detest 12-step ideology, but one thing that I'll share with him just for a second is that the first step to being able to build the kind of movement that we need to turn this around is to acknowledge that we don't have it yet, right? And one of the problems is that progressives, leftists, whatever, tend to focus way more on mobilizing, which means, as Jane McAlevey puts it brilliantly, getting the people who already agree with you to move on something, but not very much on organizing, which is talking to people who don't already agree with you and to try and bring them along. The mobilizing route has won victories for us, obviously, but it's been pretty skimpy on populist outcomes lately. And by lately, I mean probably as long as most of our listeners can remember. Part of what we've got to do is, like, in addition to trying to mobilize outrage and awareness and whatnot, is at the same time, right, on the other leg, basically, to do the more slow drip kind of work of trying to build a constituency for the perspective that's embodied, like, in the politics that we're trying to pursue. Now, does that make sense?
And you have people thinking sequentially, Adolph, making connections. Like, there's a direct connection from the crumbling of schools and public transit and drinking water systems and back in communities all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
And the public money that's going into the trillion-dollar military-industrial complex. There's a direct connection between all these tax escapes of the super wealthy and the corporations, supported by too many Democrats, not just Republicans, and the starvation of public health departments that rendered our country so unprepared, apart from Trump's expansion of the virus pandemic by his neglect and ignorant actions.
Yeah, absolutely.
The starvation of these local resources. And that's part of education. Education means making connections, not just one impulsive response to some symbol that people don't like or some phrase or word that people don't like.
Exactly. I mean, I've been saying this since Katrina, and to be honest, I mean, it's a kind of tribalist perspective, but the way that the coronavirus has exposed how hollowed out public health infrastructure is around the country just makes me think of what happened after Katrina. And it's like the same thing. Like, you remember, you're going back to the Exxon Valdez spill, right? It turns out that the company skated on having the permanent cleanup crews to put to work in emergencies like those spills. That's what's happened on a bipartisan basis from local government to the national government for 40 years again, where the Republicans say we're cutting these services, period. The response from the Democrats is, well, we don't really need to fund them at what seems like the adequate level because they're so much smarter and we can do more with less. Well, doing more with less means fundamentally that you're not prepared when a crisis happens. And I mean, here we are. And it's vitally important that we help people see the connections. I mean, just like at the municipal level, tax giveaways, tax increment financing, or other tax breaks that encourage rent intensifying redevelopment over funding public services shows up in the same way, right? And people don't understand why there's not enough money to fund public education adequately. And the politicians, no matter what party they belong to, have a vested interest in shifting the public's attention away from where the actual sources of revenue drain are.
The word corporatism has to be right up there with racism.
Yeah.
Corporatism is a equal opportunity injustice that pervades our entire political economy and our elections. And we've got to get stronger muscular language here to deal with the reality on the ground. We're running out of time, Adolph. I know we wanted to discuss a column I wrote a few weeks ago called Why Do Americans Give Away So Much Control to Corporations? They own the public lands, they give it up. They own the public airways, they give it up.
Yeah.
They own the research and development that built all these industries coming out of the government to build Silicon Valley and aerospace and biotech and so on. And they give it up. They own the pensions, trillions of dollars invested in Wall Street securities, and they let the corporations control it. So if listeners want to read the column, and maybe we can discuss it in another interview,
Yeah, it's a great column.
Just
Yeah.
go to nader.org.
Good.
And I want to give Steve and David just an opportunity to come in here.
Adolph, obviously, Joe Biden has had a long career in politics in Congress, and he is a creature of that institution. And he's certainly in that time not proven himself to be what you would call a great man. But in this moment, there seems to be an opportunity for him to have greatness thrust upon him, much like, say, Lyndon Johnson had after the Kennedy assassination. Do you see that happening as an historian? Do you see those parallels? And what can we hope for in that sense? Can he be a Lyndon Johnson?
Well, it's funny, because a cousin of mine and I were talking about this a couple of days ago, and in the family, metaphor, it wasn't Johnson, it was Pope John the 23rd. But yeah, I don't know. What it would take would be for a balance of forces that he felt he needed to respond to, right? Biden is maybe better than some of the others in the sense that he's old enough to have a sense, ironically, the Nixon administration did, that the presidency is a kind of stewardship of the republic, basically. And you've got some sort of commitment, right, that's beyond yourself, or even, more crudely, just as an understanding of the horse trading aspects of politics. So we got more from Nixon in a lot of ways than, and by we, I mean people with our interest, than we have from any of the Democratic presidencies since then. Biden could, and certainly the fact that his victory was so clearly dependent on minority voters and labor. But you know how that stuff goes, Steve, too. You've been around the block. The crucial vote is the one that the winner determines he most wants to listen to. So if they want to tell us that Lincoln Project is what turned the tide for Biden, then we'll get a Biden. Then that'll be a sign of a Biden administration that's going in one direction. So, I hope he does. My watchword is always pretty much the same: optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect.
Right.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, Adolph. We're talking to Adolph Reed, professor, still teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, still writing, and still grappling with the fundamentals of the structure of power and justice in our country. Thank you very much, Adolph, and to be continued.
All right, thanks, Ralph. Steve, yes, I look forward to it, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Professor Adolph Reed. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break. When we return, our favorite constitutional lawyer stops by to say, I told you so. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 22, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Better Markets released a report last week that details for the first time the nearly 400 major legal actions against the 6 largest Wall Street banks over the past 20 years. Wall Street's 6 biggest banks, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo, have been subject to almost 400 major legal actions and have paid almost $200 billion in fines and settlements during the last 20 years, said Dennis Kelleher of Better Markets. Every one of those major legal actions are detailed in the report we are releasing today, and they show that those banks have committed almost every conceivable type of financial crime or violation, often repeatedly. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Well, he told us so, David.
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar who previously appeared on this program in 2019 to outline 13 articles of impeachment for President Trump, and October 2020 to outline 14 reasons President Trump was a clear and present danger and should be removed from office. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, and he is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, and American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you for inviting me.
Welcome, Bruce. Let's get right to the forthcoming trial of Donald J. Trump in the U.S. Senate. It looks like it's going to occur It looks like Trump is losing some of his base among Republicans, notably leader Mitch McConnell, who excoriated Trump as a major factor in the storming of the Congress on January 6th. Give us some of your thoughts, and how do you think this trial should be run?
Well, first of all, I believe that we need to have live witnesses. I think that if you compare the difference in the outcome, there are many other differences too between the Watergate. It didn't ultimately end in a trial because President Nixon resigned, but leading up to the events and the conclusions, 3 articles of impeachment in the House of Representatives, we all were able to see John Ehrlichman, H.R. Haldeman, John Mitchell, John Dean. We could see the witnesses. We had a sense of the real life people, their credibility, and how impacted the American people. We can't have this trial by video, by Zoom, by just a written record. We need live witnesses in order to fully engage the American people and to underscore its importance. So the first thing that needs to happen is the Senate has to conclude that although the constitutional text is not clear on this point, that Chief Justice John Roberts should preside. It's the gravity of the situation. What's at stake is someone who has sought to tear the Constitution asunder. And if he's not convicted and prevented from running from office again, which is one of the punishments that comes from conviction for impeachment, the country, in my judgment, has not got a whole lot of staying power to remain a democratic, free country.
And you say the Constitution is not clear on the point because the trial comes after Trump has left for office. It's very clear that if the president is in office, the Chief Justice.
That is correct.
Presides.
Yes, because the Chief Justice, of course, did preside at Trump's first impeachment trial. Now, some have raised this issue, well, can you have an impeachment trial after someone's no longer in office? That was settled in 1876 when Secretary of War Henry Belknap resigned even before he was impeached. He was accused of bribery. The House impeached him after the resignation, went to the Senate for trial. He argued there wasn't any jurisdiction, and the Senate rejected that argument 37-29. There are at least 2 reasons why there needs to be a trial even after someone has left office. One is to set a precedent that is a warning to future occupants of office that this kind of behavior will result in your removal. And second is to disqualify somebody from running for office again because they're clear and present danger to our constitutional dispensation.
Now, do you think that they should subpoena Trump to testify, and would that boomerang on the Democrats?
Well, I think, an issue that remains open here, it seems to me, is, criminal intent by Mr. Trump. Was he inciting violence? Was he inciting the insurrection, the seditious conspiracy, the destruction of property, and actually resulted, unfortunately, in the deaths of individuals in the Capitol Police, and others who were participants in that whole affray. And that's an element of incitement, is intent. And so clearly you want to have Mr. Trump there to give him an opportunity to explain. What did you mean when you say we have to fight them there? This is going to be a theft of the election. Pence has authority to not count the votes if he doesn't want to, and said concurrently with his personal attorney saying we need trial by combat. Well, what did you mean when you said those words? And especially
that was Rudy Giuliani.
Rudy Giuliani, yes,
on the mall.
On the mall at the same time, it's the same crowd. I call them, you're afraid, a fevered mob, and also confronted with the fact that we now have almost a half a dozen or more participants in the storming who have said, "Oh yeah, of course, I did interpret the language. It was a direct order, to storm the Capitol, to use violence to prevent the counting of the votes." And some of them have actually called Mr. Trump to pardon them. Now, obviously, he didn't do that, but that is the strength of their conviction that they were following the president's orders. And how does he explain that?
Now, let's elaborate this enforcement process. You don't have to prove criminal intent to be convicted on impeachment in the U.S. Senate, but Trump is exposing himself to normal criminal prosecution for what he did, as any citizen would be. He doesn't have any immunity for that. Indicate how mild the impeachment process is, given the enormity of what he did. And
well,
can he still be prosecuted, or is at the end of it if he's convicted, removed from office, and stripped of his right to run for public office.
No,
in the
well,
future.
first of all, it's surely true that impeachment is not a criminal proceeding. It's a civil proceeding. And that's why, you don't have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not the standard. And you don't have the same rights to cross-examination, and the privilege against self-incrimination doesn't exist in a civil case. And that's what impeachment is. They clearly, after he's impeached and disqualified from running, it's because the maximum Trump can get now is disqualification from running for office, federal office again. After that, the Constitution is very explicit. He can be exposed to criminal prosecution, where the standards of proof are much more exacting. But if you look at the article that was voted by the House, it does cite insurrection and incitement, and therefore, under their own words, they have to at least have some evidence of criminal intent or some kind of proof of intent, even if it wouldn't satisfy a guilty verdict, in a criminal prosecution because of different procedures. They don't have to find it met that threshold of incitement, but a lesser threshold would still justify removal from office. That's why I think they have to get a sense of Mr. Trump being subpoenaed, and then it denies the argument that, this was a witch hunt. He didn't get a chance to defend himself. Well, he did. He had a chance to explain himself completely with his own lawyers there and respond to the fact that those who were in the crowd said, of course, I was following orders, and respond to the discrepancy. Staggering discrepancy from the words, we got to fight, weakness is never acceptable, losing is never acceptable, with the words that came forth, a day or two later, where in a scripted message he said, well, you're not really a Trumpist if you're for violence, you're not a Trump person if you don't respect law enforcement. A wholly different tone. Whether it was sincere or not, it was not what he said on January 6th. And you could ask, well, you knew then what words were needed if you wanted to try to quell rather than foment a rebellion, and you didn't use them. We know you didn't use them because you look at your script of January 6th with what came a day or two later, and the difference is staggering.
When he saw watching it on television in the White House unfold, he didn't make any effort to call back his supporters.
Kevin McCarthy is minority leader in the House. Kevin McCarthy, Lindsey Graham were trying to get through to him. Hey, call off your people. We need help. Send in the armed forces. He was riveted, according to the records or the reports that we have in the Post and the New York Times. He was riveted just watching, and he was calling them patriots. He was watching the fevered mob. Even afterwards, he's not stood up, even after this happened, and said, we need to prosecute all those people. He's not. Well, then what was your intent then? If they commit crimes and you are indifferent to them, of course you didn't care whether they went up there. So whether it was intent or reckless disregard, he knew he was throwing a match on kindling, ready to have it light.
Well, to convict him requires 2/3 of the U.S. Senate, and that means there needs to be at least 17 Republican senators voting to convict him. Do you think that will happen?
I think if I was betting right now, I think there's 50-50. Obviously, some of it depends upon how effective the House is in presenting its case. Because in addition to the issue of the insurrection and the seditious conspiracy on January 6th, we have the few days earlier where clearly Mr. Trump was calling the Georgia Secretary of State and a few days earlier another electoral official, asking them to falsify the Georgia election returns, find additional votes. Well, you could be criminally prosecuted if you don't throw out those election returns. So they obviously need to call the Secretary of State and the other officials, say, well, and they recorded the conversations because they knew that they could expect the worst from Mr. Trump.
It was Trump that accused the Secretary of State of being vulnerable to criminal prosecution when he was behaving in a way that clearly violated the Georgia criminal code.
In the federal criminal code too. It's in Title 52. It makes it illegal to try to falsify or interfere with the rights of the state to elect presidential electors in a fair and free fashion. So he violated both federal and state law at the same time, as he's accusing, is threatening, or maybe the veiled threat, or maybe it wasn't so veiled, threat to prosecute Mr. Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, unless he manipulated the votes. So Mr. Trump won. He makes these crazy statements about the voting machines being rigged so that they would count Biden votes 3 times and not Trump votes and things like that. Rudy Giuliani went down there and manipulated a video that he alleged showed that there were votes that were miscast or miscounted. when in fact it had been clipped and it was shown to be a fraudulent representation of what in fact was occurring. All those things that Trump knew about, and he was obviously concealing them or wasn't disturbed at all by them. We also know, just if we go back, and this is permitted in trials, when someone has passed similar acts, has developed a long-standing reputation and habit of acting with a certain state of mind, it can be introduced, as evidence that that state of mind also was present in a current event. And we now have John Bolton saying, obstruction of justice was a way of life at the White House. All the instances where Trump was trying to obstruct the Mueller investigation. His whole life is nothing but obstruction. He was obstructing justice in issuing pardons to his friends and dangling pardons to hope that they would not incriminate him. And obviously, is punishing anyone who would actually try to tell the truth. So you put all that evidence together, and I think his state of mind is obvious. Mr. Trump had no interest. He does have no interest in having a free and fair count. He only was calling because he wanted the election results changed. And why is he just choosing to approach the states where he lost? He doesn't suggest that he's going to ask any other states to do recounts or rejigger the votes with where he won. So we know that he had a corrupt state of mind, but it's important that the House present the case solidly with evidence. There's no need to rush it really fast to accommodate Mr. Biden's program. If it takes a little bit longer, it does, because this impeachment trial is for the ages. It's for a precedent that hopes to prevent a reoccurrence for 100, 200 years for posterity. And we can't compromise their liberty because Mr. Biden wants to get a few weeks advance running start on his domestic program.
Well,
that
also,
can wait.
They can split the day, work a full week for a change, work on weekends. They can split the day for part of it for the impeachment trial and part of it for Mr. Biden or the congressional agenda on policies. Let's go to the power of the executive branch. You've just written a report, which we've released, on constitutional restoration, which could be called restoration of congressional authority vis-a-vis the presidency and executive branch. Do you think that Joe Biden is going to stretch executive power as far as Donald Trump? He's going to revoke a lot of Trump's illegal executive orders. What's your view so far? What are the early signs?
Well, the early signs are not promising. The earliest sign, perhaps, was testimony of his Secretary of State nominee, Tony Blinken, when he said he wouldn't necessarily submit treaties for ratification. He could say that some occasions he'll just do them as executive agreements, which are just agreements between the president and foreign powers, because diplomacy might suggest that's a good idea. Well, the Constitution says nothing about executive agreements. A treaty is defined as a sovereign contract between sovereign nations. And he was speaking in the context of any kind of nuclear deal that may be concluded with Iran. Go back to the 1922 Naval Conference, which set limits on building naval ships between big powers, and that was a treaty. All these arms control agreements have been treaties. The SALT treaties, the open skies treaties, even we have migratory bird treaties. And then suddenly, we can't get treaties anymore. And this wasn't just the first time. You remember when NATO was first ratified as a treaty, it excluded Spain, that was then run by Francisco Franco, because of the dislike of his fascism, if you will, and the Spanish Civil War. And the result was that when Eisenhower came in, he just basically de facto made Spain part of NATO through executive agreements. That's why we had air bases at Rota, and remember we had even nuclear bombs that were dropped inadvertently in Spain during their period where they're so-called outside of NATO, but inside through executive agreements. And so this is just another example. Well, wait a minute. I'm not saying that a treaty that with Iran is not a good idea. I'm all in favor of it, but it's still a treaty. Process is important. You just can't conclude it on your own.
Let's give some other examples. Biden spent a lot of years in the Senate. He knows what congressional authority is and should be. So let me ask you a couple very short questions. Do you think Biden would spend money like Trump did for the wall that was distinctly opposed and not authorized by the Congress?
Well, I would sure hope not. But, I can't be conclusive simply because You remember there were a couple of occasions where Obama spent money that he wasn't supposed to spend, especially remember the deal down in Guantanamo where he didn't give proper notice to Congress when he was swapping Guantanamo detainees for Bergdahl. And I just don't know. The pressures in the White House, people act differently. And Obama was a senator too, and he didn't pay any attention to any Senate prerogatives whatsoever.
Do you think that Biden would violate and defy congressional subpoenas the way Trump has done over 100 times and gotten away with it?
Well, I would hope not. But, Ralph, the disconcerting thing is Mr. Biden was vice president under Obama for 8 years, right? He's got some independence because he actually is separately elected. And Obama flouted subpoenas regularly, not as flagrantly as Trump. Eric Holder wasn't going to release information relating to the operation that were overlooking some gun violations, gun running down near Mexico. And they asserted these privileges. Remember, Obama wouldn't permit the release of the Senate torture program. He wouldn't permit the release of the 28 pages on Saudi complicity in 9/11. And Biden's in the administration. Now, of course, he doesn't have the final decision. But you have a way to leak out stuff if you don't like it, and it's just a different deal. He's certainly not Trump. I certainly agree with that. I mean, I have no doubt that he would never, for a moment, try to suggest that that an election after it had been fully exhausted and a result had been declared by the states, he would never do anything like Trump tried to do, to question the legitimacy of any successor.
Let's see if he's going to do what Obama and George Bush did in terms of use of armed force overseas.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And because, again, I don't want to extrapolate too much, but Tony Blinken, when he had about an 8-hour hearing in Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and all these issues, and Rand Paul had raised these issues, that the president just, uses military force on his own. How does the AUMF relating to Afghanistan justify forces in Libya and Syria and Somalia? Now the forces, we fight Somalia now with troops in Kenya. And there wasn't any suggestion, well, we really got to come back to Congress and get authority again. And this is just a historical fact, Ralph. No president ever, including Jimmy Carter, ever surrendered executive power voluntarily back to the Congress, no matter whether they're Napoleonic personality or self-effacing personality. It's just the dynamic of the office. We don't want to cling to power.
But you think he will follow the Obama doctrine of prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner overseas on his own say-so?
Yes, I certainly do. Because the way in which he can stop it is simply make an announcement, issue an executive order. I'm not going to do this anymore. That's the authority that he has right now. And he was there for the 8 years. In the Obama administration, we don't have any evidence that he ever spoke up against it. Indeed, I think that one of the things that he kind of praised, and Blinken praised, I think, was sitting there and watching the president play judge, jury, prosecutor, executioner to kill Osama bin Laden. And, there wasn't any effort to try to capture him. And so I don't think he's going to renounce that. If you say it's really
even American citizens overseas?
Well, he didn't say anything about Mr. Al-Awlaki and his teenage son were American citizens. They were vaporized. So I don't know whether he would draw that distinction. I don't know.
Well, do you think the drone warfare will continue regardless of international law? Do you think that the troops will be expanded in Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia?
I don't know how much the expansion will be. I don't think they're coming home. There's no testimony of any of his national security team who've ever voiced any sense that, hey, we got to stop these endless wars. And I say it's not because we're callous. You got to know what you don't know. And, we're not going to turn Afghans into Canadians. It's not going to happen. We're sending our own troops over there to risk their lives and their limbs. And we have to have a foundation for thinking that we're there legitimately. The fact is, under international law in the United Nations, that's almost our brainchild, says, you cannot use force in a foreign country, except in self-defense, meaning you're the subject of actual or imminent attack on your boundaries. We do that to other countries, every day without blinking an eye. And that's not to say that we can't give support by example, that we encourage that peace move forward. But unless Congress is going to declare war and we've been attacked, we have to accept the fact that, other people in countries, can go their own separate ways if they're not attacking us.
Steve and David, any input here?
What fascinated me most, Bruce, was your contrasting during possible impeachment trial how to use Trump's words against him. Because, my first impulse as a non-lawyer would be say, well, if you get him to explain himself, then he's going to be able to put the finest face on it and tell you that that's not what I really meant. But you're saying contrasting his statements and the timing of them, that was a really fascinating technique of being able to get the truth out.
That's right. And remember also, we're dealing with somebody who his own lawyer, John Dowd, said, we're never, ever going to put him under oath because he's an incorrigible liar. His own lawyer says that. So the idea that he's really fast on his feet, and will know how to, wiggle out of this, I think is totally wrong-headed understanding of Mr. Trump's fixation on falsehood after falsehood. He can't even make up, good lies.
And I think your characterization of the word incorrigible was generous. I don't think that it was even the word he said. I think the word he said began with an F.
Okay. Well, listen, I know the airwaves and
yes.
7 dirty words you're not supposed to do,
Thank you very much.
Okay. I guess we're out of time. We've been speaking with Bruce Fein, who is a constitutional law expert, actually served in the Reagan Justice Department years ago, and is the author of a new report on restoring our Constitution. This is a very practical, policy-oriented report on how we can get Congress to reassert its own authority that it has in the Constitution vis-a-vis the executive branch and hold situations like empire and other forays and violations of the law and Constitution by the presidency accountable, or at least to restrain it. So good to have you on the show, Bruce. As usual, keep up the good work.
Yeah, I always remember the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that's what our duties are as citizens.
Well said.
We've been speaking with Bruce Fein. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. That's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Professor Adolph Reed and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out here. But for you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And check out Wrecking America, How Trump's Lawbreaking and Lies Betray All, written with Mark Green, and the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, Classic Recipes from Lebanon and Beyond. We will link to both of those.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Hi, this is Jimmy Leeward, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. First, Ralph continues his conversation with Professor Adolph Reed.
At your point of the civic education in neighborhoods and schools, etc., look at how wonderful the results can be. All that I'm going to say right now can be changed through Congress and state legislatures. So now, all the stuff that's happened in the last 2-3 weeks, the assault on Congress and all, none of that would have happened if we didn't have the Electoral College. It's the Electoral College and the ritual in Congress as part of the Electoral College that set up this system. So we've got a movement to get rid of the Electoral College pernicious effect called nationalpopularvote.com. And they've already got over half of the state electoral votes. Laws have been passed in California, New York, Illinois, etc., saying they'll give their Electoral College vote to whoever wins the national popular vote. All right, just think of all the agony that's been going on 2000 campaign, 2016 campaign, where the Democrats won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College vote. Look at all the agony from the lack of universal health care, benefits denied, corruption in billing practices, people dying because they can't have health insurance. Well, single-payer health insurance, 30, 40 countries in the world, from Canada to Western Europe to Taiwan, they have it. We don't. Why don't we focus on that? That can go through Congress. The third thing is poverty. Well, dire poverty can be relieved by universal basic income, which is being considered in other countries, and which conservative and liberal economists, including Milton Friedman, supported. Well, that can go through Congress. And then we have the voting issue, voting suppression, all the mess with fooling around with registration trickery and obstructing voting and changing voting precinct addresses and disavowing signatures and absentee voting obstruction. All that can be removed by universal voting as a duty, just like in Australia and several other countries. That would go through the state legislatures and Congress would have a role. So these kinds of fundamental, relatively simple changes should be part of the civic education drive all over the country. And as I've said, 1% of the people organized on Congress in every congressional district reflecting public opinion and public desire and well-being can defeat any lobbyist on Capitol Hill. That's 2.5 million people organized in congressional district. What's wrong with the progressive movement? What's wrong with the civil rights movement? What's wrong with all these so-called movements that they can't get down to roots, to their basic causes that have to be removed and replaced with resolutions that other countries have adopted?
Well, yes, good question, Ralph. And I hear the frustration in your voice and I share it. I mean, I think one thing about it is, and, I've been saying this in one venue or another for decades now, is that I don't understand how it is we're supposed to be able to create the broad-based popular movement that we need to act on any of those things if we have to start out by going around the room to insist on what we don't have in common. So it seems to me that one of the most consequential casualties of how people have come to understand what the left is the very idea of broad popular solidarity. And I think that that's something that we need to build on as well. And look, in all fairness, I mean, that's also been coming from every direction on the Republican electoral spectrum, right? But one of the most effective weapons, apparently, that the other side has against us, and this really also sounds like a cliche from 1890, but keeping us divided with differences that are more artificial than they are real.
That's right. These subjects we've been discussing elicit conservative, liberal people, workers raising their families. I mean, they want the same thing. We've gone through that. I think first of all, there's too much diagnosis without follow-up. We live in a golden age of muckraking books. We've done our part by putting out muckraking books. Golden age of muckraking documentaries never come close to the number we have today, and never come close to their having less effect. Like you said, we've got to go into the organizing level, not simply the exposing level.
Right. No, I think that's where we are, Ralph. And frankly, I've kind of lost patience even for reading the muckraking anymore. Because, past a certain point, the only difference is going to be the daily body count, right? Because what the deep structures are that are reproducing the injustice, the inequality, the misery. And it's easy, to hit a groove where making the expose becomes the political career. But at some point, you're right. And I'm not saying that it's got to be the same individuals, right? I'm not saying that the investigative and the reporter needs to go organize a poultry plant, but the activities need to be considered in connection with each other.
Speaking of trade unions, do you think there's a possibility of revival here? They could have put enough organizers in the field at the right time in recent years to get single payer. I mean, they got insurance for their own rank and file, and they didn't really lift much of their weight and put people in the field in every congressional district. You think there's going to be a revival? You think there'll be more union membership around the corner?
I hope so. I mean, I know we desperately need it and we can't go any place without it. And that's the one most reason to be hopeful, or greatest reason to be hopeful, I think, about Walsh, because I think there's a good chance that we'll get a different National Labor Relations Board and at least administrative changes that'll make it easier to organize and to fight against losses. I mean, among other things, like at some point, we got to get rid of this fiction that you can call a worker a contractor, or worse yet, an entrepreneur, to justify making their terms of employment more of the precarious and, denying them benefits. So there's a lot of that. And it's also, look, the Democrats wouldn't have control of the Senate Biden probably wouldn't be in the White House. As I have been saying since Election Day, when I talk to anybody from outside southeastern Pennsylvania, you're welcome, right? But in Nevada and Arizona, Georgia, and again the Senate race, and Philly, right, and Pittsburgh, which is what carried Pennsylvania. It was the trade union movement and the bodies on the ground and concerted effort. And I'll give a particular shout out here to my friends in Unite Here, who put hundreds, if not thousands, of bodies on the ground for weeks and months at a time, doing old-fashioned shoe leather organizing to deliver this election for the Democrats. So now it's time to start thinking about what a real union agenda ought to look like and what a working class agenda connected to a union agenda ought to look like.
Adolph, we're talking with Adolph Reed, Professor Emeritus, University of Pennsylvania, author of many books and articles on justice. Until we hear the phrase repeal Taft-Hartley Act, and until we hear the phrase coming out of the Democrats, card check, they're not serious about expanding their base. Without the unions, they wouldn't be elected.
That's right.
And less than 100,000 votes in 4 swing states, less than 100,000 votes switched would have won the election for Donald Trump against Joe Biden.
Right.
That's how close we came to that.
Yeah.
So it's the language. When you hear people on our side and they constantly talk about liberal elites, but they don't talk about corporate crooks and corporate power, they're not going to get from here to there. And I don't see anybody in Congress even daring to say they want to repeal the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which is the chokehold against millions of workers forming unions, and if they have unions, having stronger unions.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the main reasons that the South isn't organized more effectively at this point. And for all of the problems that an unchallenged capitalist class power in the South has caused for the rest of the country, right? It's been dragging all of us down. So yeah, no, absolutely. So a grad advisee of mine mentioned in a course a couple of years ago, and I was still teaching, it was a course on Black American political thought. And she was leading a discussion of readings that covered a period from the mid-30s to the mid-40s. And there were a lot of readings, people like Ralph Bunche, A. Philip Randolph, many, many others. And she remarked when she began her discussion that she was struck that none of the people whom she read understood the political project as fighting racism or fighting white supremacy. They were all focused on fighting for or against the specific policies and policy proposals with an understanding of what the impact of those would likely be on Black people as working people as much as anything else. So that's something else that we need to get back to. People don't talk about policies anymore, right? I mean, I would bet you, Ralph, that AOC and the squad don't ever think about the Taft-Hartley.
And now we do a little postmortem with Bruce Fein.
Hi, Bruce.
Yeah.
What favor did Barr do the Biden administration?
What did Barr do?
Say it again, David, because you just got out there. What favor?
Oh, what favor did William Barr did to the Biden? Well, he did one favor in saying we had investigation, and no, there isn't any evidence that there was, to the extent that there was any fraud, clearly wouldn't have any impact on the outcome of the election. Mr. Biden won. And he also denounced the insurrection and seditious conspiracy as completely outrageous and having no justification whatsoever. It was a tacit rebuke of Mr. Trump. And coming from Mr. Barr, who was otherwise a complete loyalist, and I would call him a lickspittle of Trump, that speaks volumes. And it's a Justice Department official, too, making that assertion.
I meant unitary executive theory. What favors did Barr do for the Biden administration? What new powers will they find?
Well, he was in favor. Well, he was in favor, going back to his first tour as Attorney General, of limitless executive power to go to war whenever he felt like it. He claimed that he didn't have to show up for hearings if he didn't feel like it. Limitless power to defy subpoenas, that president could rule by decree, by executive order. He didn't have to go through statutes or legislation. He's the one who supported appointing all these people as principal officers of the United States, acting this and acting that without any Senate confirmation. maybe that's something Biden will want to do if he thinks some of his nominees going to have a tough row getting a confirmation. Maybe that's less likely now that the Senate's controlled by the Democrats. But still, it's still 50-50. It doesn't give you much margin for error. So in all those respects, Barr strengthened, at least the legal regime of limitless executive power.
And finally, Ralph has a few words to say about Jeffrey Toobin and proportionality.
All right. Well, another thing you want to talk about, Ralph, has to do with, these are quotes from Jonathan Alter from a New York Times article on the firing of Jeffrey Toobin from the New Yorker. This is a little bit of a shift of gears here. And here are the quotes. This is from Jonathan Alter to Jeffrey Toobin. You are a fine person and a terrific journalist and did nothing here to hurt anyone outside of yourself and your family. Jonathan Alter, a friend of Mr. Toobin's for 40 years, tweeted after Mr. Toobin announced his exit from the New Yorker. Then he also said, I don't like Twitter mobs and I don't like bullies from the left or the right taking part in cancel culture. He said by phone, I have trouble with the conflation of offenses. I don't put Al Franken in the same category as Harvey Weinstein. So, Ralph, what do you want to say about that?
Well, for example, the worst savage sexual predator in public life, apart from Weinstein, was President Donald Trump and his career of assaulting women, raping women, violence against women. He's already embroiled in tort litigation, bragging about it on television, what he can do to women, and he got away with it. The Sackler family, which was responsible for pushing all these opiates and making billions of dollars with hundreds of thousands of deaths over the years in our country, escaped with a fine and no personal prosecution. So the point I think that Jonathan Alter was making, who just came out with a biography of Jimmy Carter, by the way, is proportionality. Jeffrey Toobin basically thought his Zoom machine was off and he started playing with himself. And as a result, he lost his New Yorker position, where he was a writer. He marginalized or perhaps lost his commentator position on CNN. All kinds of other arrangements, publishing and movie arrangements were canceled. He, up until then, had a very distinguished career. He wrote books on the Supreme Court, and he was quoted in the New York Times. And then you have these real predators getting away with it. And so we really have to ask ourselves about proportionality here. And I had no luck whatsoever in getting Senator Gillibrand and other people in Congress to pay more attention during the impeachment process, the first impeachment process, about Trump's savage sexual predation against women. And he did get away with that. And what kind of message is that to young boys and young men all over the country who looked at Trump as a role model? He got away with it.
Well, when you talk about proportionality, Harvey Weinstein is in prison. Al Franken had to give up his Senate seat. And there's this conflation that Al Franken is guilty of. He's rewriting the narrative and claiming that he is a victim of the cancel culture. He was canceled because of what he did, which was touch women inappropriately. And I know that if I were accused of forcibly kissing a woman or touching women, and I was called into Chuck Schumer's office, I would fight. I'd go before the ethics committee.
Which is what he did. He asked for an ethics committee investigation. And the Democrats, in one afternoon, Senator Leahy and others regret, jumped on him and told him he had to get out of the Senate before he had a hearing and due process in the House Ethics Committee. So accusations are not the end of the story.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome Jerry Cox, author of the book Killer Airbags. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way